Socrates begins his creation of Callipolis by noting correctly that human beings need one another. He says, "The origin of the city is to be found in the fact we do not severally suffice for our own needs, but each of us lacks many things. As a result of this, we gather many into one place of abode as associates and helpers, and to this dwelling together we give the name city or state, do we not?" The creator of the city, then, is in a sense our human need for food, housing, and clothes. In the course of this discussion, Socrates adumbrates an embryonic version of the principle of the division of labour and the principle of comparative advantage. It is better for us all if we do not all attempt to do everything for ourselves, and it is more productive if among the things we are good at we work at that which we are best at. He says, "Would one man do better at working at many tasks or one at one? More things are produced, and better, and more easily, when one man performs one task according to his nature at the right moment and at leisure from other occupations." Such a city will need many specialists working at their professions. It will also need traders, and to facilitate trade are market and money and merchants. All this seems perfectly reasonable, but apparently, while such activities are necessary for a city to come into being, they're not sufficient. Once our basic producers and traders are in place, there will arise a whole host of service providers, and with the consequent increase in wealth, an increasing desire on the part of many for more and more wealth, so that among the service providers we shall need specialists in the provision of security to protect our property from predation. The desire to possess more than we need thus gives rise to a class of people specializing in the provision of security. The existence of this class in turn gives rise to the inordinate desire to have more and more honor and respect. To hold this in check, we need yet another level of organization. Plato writes, "Unless either philosophers become kings in our states, or those whom we now call our kings and rulers take to the pursuits of philosophy seriously and adequately, and there is a conjunction of these two things, political power and philosophical intelligence, there can be no cessation of troubles." It is perhaps ironic that this over-intellectualized account of politics is derived from a sound analysis of the practical exigencies that force men into society in the first place. Plato notes accurately that the good life requires a division of labour, so that we do not all have to spend all our time trying to do everything for ourselves. If we are to make the best of things, we should, to the extent that it is possible, do more or less exclusively that at which we are most competent. So, just as we get our shoes from a shoemaker and not the butcher, because the shoemaker is the one who really knows how to make shoes, so too we should get our government from those who really know what the good for man is, and not from some second-rate amateur. This bottom-up account of the origination of society is largely agreeable to lovers of liberty, for it implies that social life is natural to man, and that our natural condition is not, as Hobbes or Machiavelli would have it, a war of all against all. The problem with Plato's account comes, however, with his conclusion that statesmanship or governance requires a special kind of intellectual knowledge which only some people have, and that they are to exercise governance just as a shoemaker is to be allowed to get on with making shoes. Plato wants us to believe then that his account of the ruler is no different in essence from his account of every other specialist in society. It will strike listeners that there is one obvious disanalogy between Plato's correct account of the division of labour and comparative advantage and his somewhat more dubious account of the ruler of the state. It is this. Our dealings with shoemakers and such like are voluntary. We enter into arrangements for the purchase or repair of shoes voluntarily, and we can alter those arrangements voluntarily. Nor is it the case that all shoemakers are equally competent or equally reasonable in their charges. Still less is it the case that there should be one and only one shoemaker in the state. If the analogy were to be pursued thoroughly, we would have contingent arrangements with our rulers, subject to change or alteration as necessary. Rulers would vary in their abilities and competences and their charges, and there could be more than one ruler. Plato is notorious in the Republic for advocating what has come to be called the noble lie. This is a kind of realpolitik procedure to deceive enemies and keep the lower classes in their places. Matters, however, are not quite as simple as they first appear. The paradoxical sounding noble or true lie for Plato is a verbal deception intended to bring about someone's true welfare, whatever that person may believe to be the case about that welfare. This is a conception of truth-telling which is such that if the end or purpose of the literal untruth is the genuine good of the other, then we are not only entitled to say it, but it may even be our duty. Perhaps one way to think about the noble lie is to think of it as a kind of constitutive myth that, while literally false, is nonetheless useful in bringing about the cohesion and solidity of the people in the city. Can we think of anything in use in our own society that might fit the bill? Well, what about the idea of a nation? The conception that all the people living in a particular area with similar customs and language are, as it were, all part of the same family, all born from the same stock. This is not literally true. Even in clan systems such as that of Scotland, not everyone with the same last name is in fact descended physically from the same ancestor. In this context, Reeve has a typology that might be useful to bear in mind. He distinguishes between being the victim of a false ideology, having an ideology that is falsely maintained, and being ideology free. You have a false ideology if you believe that you live in a good society when you don't, and believe this because what you are told by your leaders is false. You have an ideology falsely maintained when you believe that you live in a good society, and you in fact do, even though you believe this on the basis of falsehoods told you by your leaders. And you are ideology free when you believe you live in a good society, and you in fact do, and your belief is sustained by a worldview that is in fact true. Putting this in my own words, the distinctions are this. Being the victim of a false ideology is having the wrong beliefs for the wrong reasons. Being the victim of an ideology falsely maintained is having the right views for the wrong reasons, while being ideology free is having the right views for the right reasons. The fourth possibility, having the wrong views for the right reasons, seems to be an empty set. In the end, the acceptability of all this depends upon a certain conception of the people at large, one that sees them as being in effect children. Just as we sometimes tell our children what is not literally true, think of Santa Claus, and do so for their own good, so too the leaders in the ideal state will be permitted and may even be obliged to do the same to the masses. Even on the most charitable interpretation, this theory of the true lie is reprehensible. It is clearly a form of paternalism, and paternalism outside the family cannot be morally justified. As we shall see, this theme of the rulers knowing better than everyone else what is good for everyone else is a constant in Plato's thought. See, for example, the purely instrumental conception of religion that he will put forward in the Laws. I think it is fair to say that Plato has the aristocrat's disdain for trade and commerce in an exceptionally high degree. One place in which this comes to be seen is in his treatment of his guardians. They must be pure and uncontaminated, and so can have no connection with the mundane business of making a living. They must have no private property save what is indispensable. They will have no privacy, their houses being open to all. They are to receive just the right amount of food as a stipend, and they will eat in a common mess. Above all, they will not dirty their hands with money. Plato writes, "But for these, only of all the dwellers in the city, it is not lawful to handle gold and silver, and to touch them, nor yet to come under the same roof with them, nor to hang them as ornaments on their limbs, nor to drink from silver and gold." One commentator notes that such positions are repulsive to contemporary thought, but he asks us to be a little more understanding. Why would Plato come to such conclusions, he asks, and he answers, because of Plato's profound suspicion of the appetites and the politically destructive potential of greed and self-interest. Unfortunately, this completely fails as a defense, inasmuch as it simply erects another target for critical attack. Why should we think? what's the justification for thinking, that greed and self-interest will necessarily lead to political destruction. They might, or then again, they might not. It doesn't seem obviously absurd to argue that self-interest, suitably enlightened, might very well be the factor that forces men to associate with each other, as Plato himself might be taken to suggest in the passage already cited. This is what Plato writes. The origin of the city is to be found in the fact that we do not severally suffice for our own needs, but each of us lacks many things. As a result of this, we gather many into one place of abode as associates and helpers, and to this dwelling together we give the name city or state, do we not? Whoever wants to defend Plato's account of the ideal state has a difficult task on his hands. It presents itself to us as being both repressive and authoritarian. Is this because that is the way it is, or simply the way we judge it to be, given our modern preconceptions? The liberal conception of the state sees relatively little place for a state's active concern to implement by law and force a particular conception of the good. This is not perhaps quite consistent with the facts, given that the contemporary state is hardly neutral on many matters. Rather, it is just that our leaders are unreflectively unaware that what they take to be neutral and uncontroversial positions are in fact highly particular and in need of justification. Here I find myself in agreement with Reeve, though for substantially different reasons. He writes of the modern liberal neutral state. By seeking neutrality above all, the state may undermine certain conceptions of the good which, even though they do not illegitimately limit the freedom of others, cannot easily survive in a neutral state. Because of the extensive labour mobility necessitated by a free market economy, for instance, those who want stable neighbourhoods, extended families, close ties between the generations, or collective living are likely to find it very difficult to achieve their goals within the state. From their perspective, the supposedly neutral state is biased against their conception of the good. Reeve and I are at one in thinking that the state cannot in fact be neutral. Where he and I part company is that I take this to be an argument for the dissolution of the state. I'm not sure that he has any solution except a negotiated truce between states with rival conceptions of the good. There is a certain tendency among philosophers taking their inspiration from 19th century German philosophers to distinguish between mere freedom and autonomy. Mere freedom or instrumental freedom, which is the kind of freedom most people have in mind when the term is used, is our ability to choose this or that, free from restraint or coercion or aggression. However, our German-inspired philosophers think the exercise of such instrumental freedom may not in fact result in what we would have chosen had we a God's eye view of what is really and truly fulfilling for us, and so its exercise can, they think, result in a diminution of our autonomy or our deliberative freedom. Perhaps, as Reeve puts it, the freedom we should be concerned about is the freedom to have and to satisfy desires we would choose to have if we were aware of the relevant facts, were thinking clearly, and were free from distorting influences. This, of course, is paternalism yet again, hidden under the mantle of a philosophical distinction. Who is to determine what our counterfactual deliberative freedom requires? Who, if not the guardians or the latter-day equivalents, the state or the cognoscenti? The passage just cited from Reeve is very revealing. What's missing in mere instrumental freedom is knowledge instead of ignorance, clear thinking instead of confusion, and detachment from the exigencies of the real world instead of the messy and radically contingent experiences that is our lot. In other words, we would all be better off if we were gods instead of men. Looking then at the requirements of a state, Plato sees that there are three distinct kinds of service that must be provided. The material necessities of life must be produced and distributed, those engaged in the practical activities of production or distribution. The producers must be protected as they go about their business, and that in itself is a specialist task which requires a distinct form of expertise. Those who provide this service are called auxiliaries. And finally, someone must exercise overall control over both producers and auxiliaries and direct the activities of all for the good of all, and these are the guardians of the state. It is at this point that Plato draws his famous comparison between the state and the soul. Just as the state has three functions, so too the human soul has three parts. It has a bottom-level part that concerns itself with our basic appetites and their satisfaction, another spirited part that is concerned with providing protection, and a third intellectual part that knows, thinks, and directs the whole. Despite being famous or notorious, this comparison is hardly used in any substantive way in the Republic, and so I simply note it and move on. In fact, if anything, this comparison is somewhat limiting, a point made by George Sabine. He says, "The parallelism assumed between mental capacities and social classes is a restricting influence which prevented him," that is Plato, "from doing justice in the Republic to the complexity of the political problems under discussion." What then are the practical implications of Plato's theory? Well, the guardians, the rulers, are not allowed to have any private property, land or money. They live life in common in a kind of barracks and eat together in military style. Marriage is abolished for them, and in its place we have regulated and eugenic breeding. Plato makes the common pro-eugenic point that we devote more care and attention to the breeding of our animals than we do to the production of the future generation of human beings, and, surely, he thinks, this casual approach cannot be justified. This proto-communistic lifestyle applies only to the guardians, and to some extent to the auxiliaries. The producers are exempt from these restrictions. There are two additional striking features of Plato's account that need mention. The first is that women are, by and large, treated in just the same way as men, and are expected to contribute to the state in more or less the same way. The other unusual feature of Plato's account is that he has nothing significant to say about slavery. This in a society in which slavery plays a central role. This is all the more striking when we consider that Aristotle feels it incumbent upon him not only to discuss slavery in his Politics, but indeed to justify it. It seems that some of Plato's more radical suggestions in the Republic may have been, as it were, in the air in Athens. There are, of course, the remarkable trio of comedies by Aristophanes, Lysistrata, Thesmophoria Zeusae, and Ecclesia Zeusae, which concern themselves with the so-called women question. In the Ecclesia Zeusae, Paxinoa presents a social program that involves the communalization of all property, food and money, sexual freedom, and it's not difficult to see these reflected in Plato's Republic. Something of the same kind is reported historically by Herodotus about the Agathrysians, and in a literary mode by Euripides. This suspicion of family and property is deeply rooted in Plato and finds its way into his later works, The Statesman and the Laws, albeit in slightly different ways. Moreover, there is a distinctly clerico-military aspect to his ruling class in both the Guardians of the Republic and the sinisterly named Nocturnal Council of the Laws. Private possessions, property and family are attachments that are likely to disturb the peace and tranquility of the state. To any Athenian reading the Republic, the commonality of life required of the Guardians, the prohibition of their use of money, and, of course, their exclusion from trade or commerce, must have called to mind vividly an image of Sparta, in which such restrictions or limitations were a well-known feature of their polity. Given that virtue is knowledge, and that knowledge is the key to a good human life, education is and has to be preeminent. So it should come as no surprise to learn that Plato demands that the state provide just such an education as is right and proper, and that such education should be compulsory. And just as indiscriminate human breeding is to be reprehended, so too is the indiscriminate and disorderly way in which parents provide for the education of their children. The state requires virtue. Virtue is knowledge. Knowledge comes from education, so that the state must control education. To lovers of liberty everywhere, this account will come as no surprise. The modern state has made the provision and control of the educational curriculum a central part of its role. Students are educated in a state curriculum by teachers trained in a state-sponsored training establishment, and what students are taught and the way in which they are taught it serves to make unquestionable the very existence of the state. Returning to our ideal state with its three classes of inhabitants, the producers, the auxiliaries, and the guardians. If the guardians know what is really good in itself and for everyone, what need have we of laws? What need have we indeed for consent? If Plato is correct, and that's a big if, then we do indeed have no need of law. Law, which in Greek society meant largely custom and habit, was just another part of the grubby reality of day-to-day social life. If, however, we have a different conception of the good, a conception in which part of what it means to live a good life is to make choices for oneself and to take responsibilities for those choices, then Plato's vision is less a vision than a nightmare. Indeed, reverting to a point I made earlier, the whole ideal orientation of Plato's account, with its deliberate disdain for the murky reality of social and political life as it is actually lived, is wrong-headed from beginning to end. A suspicion of something like this, albeit a grudging admission, is revealed by the later political works of Plato, in which he attempts to provide an account of the second best type of state, the first, for obvious reasons of practicality, not being available. He never really lets go of the vision of the state he outlines in the Republic, but he ruefully accepts that such an ideal is scarcely capable of being realized, a conclusion with which lovers of liberty would gratefully agree.